often ate their own shed skin, so it was difficult to find any remains. Huiyan's eyes widened in amazement. He left the gecko on top of the rock and took out his kunai, realizing that this skin was very tough, and doing this with bare hands wasn't going to work. With the help of the kunai, he got to work. Huiyan's eyes filled with surprise since according to her, it looked just like a precious stone. Using the kunai, Soryang cut a bit of the gecko's shed skin, revealing a beautiful and shiny color. Gently, Soryang removed the skin from the gecko's leg. Pointing at it with her finger, Huiyan couldn't help but feel tenderness since it looked like gloves. He knew she couldn't resist it because even during his days as a YouTuber, videos of peeling off shed skin went viral. Now the only parts left were the head and the tail. Soryang acted carefully since one had to be cautious around the eyes so as not to hurt the creature. There was pus accumulated in the gecko's eyes. It was because it had not been able to shed completely. Now the inflammation had filled its eyes. Very carefully and gently, Soryang managed to remove the skin from the gecko's head without hurting it. With a smile, our boy asked if it felt better. The gecko's body began to tremble until it opened its eyes. Huiyan couldn't help but feel somewhat excited. Soryang began to observe the gecko closely. Huiyan asked if there was any problem. With a sincere gaze, he admitted that yes. Pointing at the gecko's tail, he mentioned that he was debating what to do with its tail. He began to sweat since he knew that to stop the necrosis, he would have to cut off the tail. But in its current state, cutting it could kill it instead. Just then, Peng Muin began to shout, asking Soryang to be careful. Upon hearing this, he and Huiyan went on alert. Peng Muin revealed that they had lost the gecko. Just then, the gecko appeared behind them. The creature's eyes began to shine with hatred. Upon noticing this, our boy panicked and asked it to calm down. Showing the kunai and holding the gecko in his arms, Soryang explained that he was only trying to help and treat its friend. Our boy's attention was fixed on the kunai and his eyes filled with surprise and confusion. Upon seeing the weapon, the gecko exploded with rage and began to roar. The gecko's body began to release an intense frozen kai, repelling Soryang. Our boy panicked, realizing that it was pissed off. The gecko jumped and upon noticing this, Huiyan stood in front of our boy and with a worried gaze asked him to be careful. Without hesitating for a second, she pushed Soryang. At that moment, the fierce gecko descended forcefully to the ground. But luckily, Huiyan and Soryang were barely saved. Soryang hugged the injured gecko tightly and fell backwards onto the ground. The attention of the other gecko fixed on them and it started roaring again. The gecko's eyes began to shine with rage. Soryang extended his hand toward it and with an expression full of fear asked it to wait a moment. With a serious gaze, Soryang admitted that this was not what it seemed, asking the creature to calm down. Just then, Soryang's eyes widened in confusion. The female gecko that Soryang was holding in his arms began to make sounds, leaving our boy somewhat confused. With eyes shining with fury, the gecko prepared to attack. But then, it calmed down and felt somewhat surprised. The two geckos began to talk to each other and couldn't help but laugh. Soryang's attention was fixed on them, making his jaw drop. At that moment, Peng Muin and his men returned to the cave and with a worried gaze, the leader asked if Soryang was okay. Gripping his sword tightly, Peng Muin admitted that the gecko was vicious and fast. He didn't expect it to slip between his legs. Upon seeing Peng Muin's sword, the gecko clenched its teeth and began to roar. Just before things could heat up, Soryang stepped in the middle, raised his hand and with a serious expression asked Peng Muin to wait a second. With a confident smile he told Peng Muin that he was fine and asked him to step back a little since he was going to try talking to him for a moment. Peng Muin's eyes filled with confusion as he didn't know if Soryang wanted to try talking to the gecko. He asked if our boy thought the gecko could understand words. Looking at the gecko, with a confident expression he said that the gecko seemed to understand speech up to a certain point and it was likely that it wouldn't attack them again. He asked if Huiyan could bring some dry grass. With a confused gaze, she nodded her head. With a cheerful smile, she and the centipede began to collect the dry grass that was near the rocks. A while later, she prepared a soft nest of dry grass for the female gecko. Soryang and Huiyan sat next to the female gecko, and our boy asked the male gecko not to worry since he was not trying to hurt her, explaining that he had removed the shell that would not come off and had taken away what was covering her eyes, asking him to make sure to keep licking her eyes for a while. The gecko approached her and with a curious gaze began to lick her eyes. Soryang crossed his arms and revealed that only one problem remained. Upon hearing this, the attention of both the gecko and Huiyan focused on Soryang. Touching his head, Soryang began to observe her tail and revealed that her eyes should heal well. But the problem was her tail. Half of it was already rotting and he didn't believe that licking it would help. The gecko began to look at her tail and couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. He turned towards Soryang and nodded with his head, saying that he was right. Forming scissors with his fingers, Soryang revealed that they would have to cut the tail. The gecko's face filled with sweat and fear when he imagined Soryang cutting her tail. The creature began to roar again. Upon seeing this, our boy felt somewhat confused. The gecko jumped and with glowing eyes prepared to attack. Soryang put his arms in front of his chest and with a gaze full of fear, began to scream. A few hours later, Peng Muen's men lit a campfire inside the cave, while Soryang and Huyen were sitting on the rocks. Using her finger, Huyen began to apply a special balm on Soryang's cheek. Our boy let out a sigh and felt furious, since he was only trying to help, but even so the gecko had bitten him. Huyen, who was applying the balm on his wound, asked him to stay still, explaining that if he moved it could leave a scar. Peng Muen, who had his arms crossed, began to laugh, saying that Soryang was finally starting to act like a real man, since after all, he had gotten a glorious scar in battle. Upon hearing this, Huyen began to stare at Peng Muen with a sinister gaze. Feeling her gaze, the patriarch could not help but feel fear. Touching his cheek, Soryang felt relieved since the misunderstanding had somehow been cleared up. The small centipedes climbed onto Huyen's body and began to play. Seeing how the centipedes were not reacting to any murderous intent, he realized that little gecko never intended to harm him in the first place. While they were distracted, Gupi appeared and called their attention. Upon hearing his voice, Soryang's and Huyen's attention turned to Gupi. Gupi appeared alongside the gecko, revealing that the creature had something to say. With a forced smile, Soryang began to touch his cheek and asked if he was ready. The gecko nodded. Soryang stood up, promising to do his best effort. But before that, he wanted to ask something to the gecko. He began to observe our boy and became somewhat curious. Showing a finger, Soryang asked what geckos ate, since if he was going to cut her tail off, she was going to need to eat something nutritious in order to recover well. Taking small jumps, the gecko turned his back on them and began to move away. Soryang panicked and started to follow him. The little gecko moved several meters away and stopped near a small plant. Soryang's eyes filled with curiosity and his attention focused on the plant. Using his mouth, the gecko pulled out the plant and began to show it to Soryang. Our boy took the small plant in his hand. Peng Muen and Huyen began to observe it closely. With a curious gaze, she asked if she could take a quick look at the plant. Our boy did not refuse and handed her the plant. Huyen took the plant and began to inspect it carefully. Showing the plant to Soryang, she revealed that although it was weak, she could feel a bit of kai seeping out. She was sure that this was a seed of a spirit herb that used to grow in this cavern. Soryang's eyes widened in confusion. He took the seed and his jaw dropped in surprise. With a serious gaze, Peng Muen revealed that he had heard about it long ago. It was said that spirit herbs always grew where spiritual beasts dwelled. The centipedes were sleeping on top of the rocks. Huyen began to observe them and explained that if that was the case, then maybe these little ones, just like the centipedes, survive by feeding on the kai of the spirit herbs. Soryang clenched his fist and his jaw dropped, realizing that if they unearthed the spirit herb, then that meant they were in serious trouble. He panicked and started to replant the herb again, but Peng Muen mentioned that it was no longer useful. Soryang planted the herb again, but Peng Muen placed his hand on his shoulder and revealed that once a spirit herb had been touched by human hands, it would not grow again. He was sure that the gecko knew this and for that reason had unearthed it to show them. Even if he replanted it, it was not going to grow beyond this point, leaving our boy in shock. Soryang began to imagine Jughu pulling out the spirit herbs that were in the cave, and the little geckos crying. Soryang's eyes filled with tears, knowing that humans were very cruel. With a curious gaze, Peng Muen asked Gupi what the name of the spirit herb that used to grow here was. Gupi began to observe him in silence, and revealed that that thing was called frost ginseng. Peng Muen began to ponder, and then a smile appeared on his face, since then all they had to do was find something that emitted the same type of kai as the frost ginseng. Upon hearing this, our boy stood up and his eyes began to shine with joy. He asked if there really was something like that. With a smile, Peng Muen nodded his head and then revealed that it was called ice jade, just like the frost ginseng. It contained the essence of cold kai. Touching his chin, he mentioned that the problem was how to obtain the ice jade, since even with money, it was not something that could be obtained easily. While they were distracted, Huyen stepped forward, capturing their attention. With a serious gaze, she said that if they were talking about the ice jade, then she knew someone who had it. Upon hearing this, a curious smile appeared on the faces of Soryang and Peng Muen, since for them this was good news. With a curious gaze, Soryang approached her and asked who had the ice jade. She panicked and asked him to calm down. She began to sweat, not knowing what to say. Seeing this, Soryong and Peng Muin became somewhat confused. Huyen swallowed saliva, then began to touch her chin and with a sincere gaze revealed that they were some other weed. Upon hearing this, our boy's jaw dropped in surprise, while on the other hand, Peng Muin became even more confused. With a serious gaze, she let out a sigh. Soryong's eyes widened in fear as he did not know what was happening.
If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, and like the video. Thank you.